I left Harriet Baldwin, who is Conservative MP for West Worcestershire and chair of the Treasury Select Committee. To her left, Dave Dugan, SNP Defence spokesman and MP for Angus. To my right, Giles Kenningham, founder of Trafalgar Strategy and a former head of press for David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. And to his right, Jonn Elledge, freelance journalist who's the author of the book Conspiracy, A History of Grollock's Theories. Note the emphasis, and how not to fall for them. Paperback out this week. Now, we've got time for an hour's worth of questions from you. You might want to ask possibly about Diane Abbott's letter to the Observer. The Health Secretary has confirmed he's taking legal action to stop the nurses' strike going ahead this weekend. The British government is being accused of being slower than other European states to help its citizens leave Sudan. And Joe Biden is expected to launch his re-election bid tomorrow. You can ask about anything you like, though. 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 and you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC, as well as watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
I didn't mention Dominic Raab there in that list of things you could ask about, because we haven't covered that on the programme, seeing as it happened after I came off air on Thursday. Right, Howard is in Aylesbury. Howard, what would you like to ask, please?
Do the panellists recognise the Great Britain Greg Hands describes with great public services?
Greg Hands on LBC 8 days ago said that basically everything was going very well with public services. Nothing to see here. Move along, please. They were all doing very, very well. Giles Kenningham.
Look, we do have some fantastic public servants in this country, but clearly there is a huge wave of discontentment. And there are some, like the Met, which I think need fundamentally reforming root and branch, and it needs a politician to do that. Regarding the nurses, I think it's a very difficult situation. I think I have a lot of sympathy for them. I think there are structural problems in the system. They should be paid more, and historically I'm not sure why we're in the situation we're in, but it's very difficult given the finances to give them huge wage hikes overnight. And bear in mind also we've got a very difficult economic backdrop at the moment, so I think to some extent, yes, it's not perfect, there are problems, there's some great public servants, but I think whoever was in power would be facing some quite severe difficulties.
Jonn Elledge.
I feel a bit sorry for Greg Hands, actually. He was on just shortly before we came on, and he was very gamely defending the government, as is his role. But it's all pretty horrible out there, isn't it? I mean, the economy's barely grown for 13 years. Cost of living is up, wages are not. Standard of living is down, house prices are through the roof. And it feels a lot like a repeat of the winter of discontent. Of course, it is difficult. Charles is right, that it would not be easy for whoever was in government.
You can't have been alive during the winter of discontent.
I barely missed it. It was about a year and a half. But my father never forgave the Labour Party for it. This was kind of the defining thing of his politics.
That's quite an interesting thing, isn't it? Because it seems to me that COVID has become the new winter of discontent, where in the 1980s the Tories sort of basically whipped the electorate at every election with the winter of discontent, and now everything's being blamed on COVID.
Well, I mean, your previous guest, Greg Hands, is still blaming everything on Labour having no money back in 2010.
He actually had the note in his pocket, which I thought
it's a good bit, but I'm not sure it's going to play with the electorate when everything is in such a state.
There was a poll out today saying still it comes up amongst 50% of people in polling groups, so obviously it does resonate. Yeah.
Oh, that's why he's got it in his pocket then, isn't it? Simple as that. Harriet Baldwin, do you think that our public services are as amazing as Greg Hands does?
Well, I think we've got some excellent public services in my constituency, some amazing public servants. I think the COVID pandemic was an incredible body blow to the NHS, and I think everyone would recognise that there's a backlog that needs to be dealt with and needs to be prioritised. And on the Treasury Select Committee, we've been really focusing on inflation, because I think everyone can see that inflation is the most ghastly tax on the whole economy. It's something that hurts the poorest the worst. And what we really need to focus on is making sure that inflation gets back down in its box to the Bank of England target.
And why isn't it doing that? Because it is going down in most other countries a lot faster than here. What do you put that down to?
Well, I think one of the problems has been that, in fact, expectations have changed. So if you look at the level of wage settlements in the Office for National Statistics numbers, they're getting into the sort of high 6s, 7%, which sort of suggests that it's getting embedded, which is why I think it's so urgent and important that the Bank of England get it back down to the target.
Is that necessarily inflationary of its own volition? I mean, just because wages are going up, I mean, in the 70s it did feed into inflation, but I wonder whether the economic circumstances are different now, and just because wages are going up faster, that doesn't automatically feed into inflation.
Well, it is one of the things that the Bank of England's really worried about. So, when we first questioned them about this in front of the committee, they said, oh, well, this is just a transitory shock. Putin has invaded Ukraine, the cost of energy's gone up enormously, and it should just feed through and then weave out of the numbers. But actually what's happened is because unemployment is very low and employment is very high, employees have had good bargaining power and they've been able to increase their wages, and that's meant that it's become more embedded in the whole economy, and therefore it's being harder to get down.
Can I ask you a very direct question?
Yeah.
Why is Andrew Bailey still in his job?
Andrew Bailey needs to be independent, so he has to be appointed to one long non-renewable term, and that really sort of makes sacrosanct the independence of the Bank of England.
But given his remit is to hold inflation to 2%, he's not doing a very good job, is he?
And our committee has been, quite rigorous in terms of highlighting some of the areas where we think, not with hindsight, but with contemporaneous evidence, that the bank should have moved faster to end quantitative easing, where they were printing all this extra money and buying bonds, and to raise rates sooner.
Because I must admit, whenever I see him giving evidence to you or making speeches or answering questions from journalists, he gives me no confidence whatsoever. And I'm thinking, well, if I don't have confidence, do the financial markets have confidence? Does the government have confidence in him?
Over the 25 years of Bank of England independence, they have succeeded in landing inflation at an average of 2%. I think it's our role on the committee, and we see the governor sort of 5 or 6 times a year, to keep holding their feet to the fire, because I think it is pretty clear to the British public that something's gone wrong here in terms of their remit, which they have one job, and that's to keep inflation low.
Dave Dugan.
So I think the question, Iain, was do we have good public services in the United Kingdom? And the answer is, of course, yes, but we need to differentiate between the operational effectiveness of our public services, whether that's the police or education or health, and the structural health of those institutions and organisations, because the difference between those is bridged often by people going to unsustainable levels above and beyond what they're actually contracted to do, and that is, of course, unsustainable. And Harriet talks about the enviable position that low unemployment and high employment creates for wage bargaining. Well, that's a good thing. You either subscribe to market forces, which the Conservatives do, or you don't. And you can't make a special case for collective bargaining to say that resources that are in short supply can't affect the price of those resources. And that's the same for nurses and teachers. And you've got to remember, of course, these are not greedy occupations. These aren't bankers. These are people that do their job. Of course, they have to pay their bills, but they do their job primarily to make a positive difference in society. But what they've had under 13 years of Conservative rule is one excuse and one reason after another for why their wages can't go up at all, or that they can go up by 1% over 2 years or something similarly risible. And people, good, ordinary people, incidentally, the government loves to talk about ordinary people. Nurses, doctors, teachers, social workers. They don't get much more ordinary than that. So these ordinary people have had enough, and they've had enough of the sort of Potemkin reason for this. It started off as austerity because Labour spent all the money and there was none left. And then it was the Brexit referendum. Then it was COVID. Now it's the war in Ukraine. It's one thing after another, and people, quite understandably, have had enough. But that doesn't mean that they're not doing their job.
But all of those things, I mean, to be fair, they have had a major impact on the economy. Inevitably, they would have had to, whether it's the English economy, the Scottish economy, whatever. I mean, Scotland is suffering from exactly the same kind of reverberations from these issues like the war in Ukraine as the rest of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, but where that stops, Iain, is where it gets to funding, because funding is what it is. It's a zero-sum game. But where you have governments that are closer to the people, they make decisions that are more consistent with the ambitions of the people, and that's why there's very many more police officers per 100,000 population in Scotland. There's many more nurses per 100,000 in Scotland. That's because of how close the Scottish government, whoever that government might be, is to the Scottish population. And the difficulty that the government has is it loves, particularly Conservative government, but Labour will do the same thing when they get in, is they love to talk about what a wealthy country the United Kingdom is. But the difficulty that they're going to face is for many of us in the electorate, it doesn't feel especially wealthy, because that wealth is resting in far too few hands. When you make a comparative assessment between directly comparable roles, such as nursing, teaching, being a police officer, the types of occupations that exist in every developed economy, you see that the UK is always to the bottom, if not the actual bottom, of developed economies for those remuneration levels. There's nowhere left to hide for the Westminster machine.
Can I just pick you up on something you said earlier, where you basically insinuated that all bankers were greedy? Bankers would no doubt respond to you that, yes, of course there are greedy bankers, but if we didn't do what we do, the country would be a lot poorer than it actually is. Did you mean to sort of throw all bankers under the bus?
Not all bankers. No, the sort of cartel casino banking that goes on in the City of London. I know for a fact that Harriet is an accomplished financier, and I don't want to besmirch her profession too much, but there was a time when banking was a noble profession, and I accept your point, Iain, that the United Kingdom is underpinned by it's upheld on a stool with three legs. One is Scottish energy, one is the City of London, and the other is everything else. So I don't underplay the role in public finance that banking plays, but it is not an occupation without its difficulties.
John?
I understood the point. That I don't think it's not that all bankers are necessarily greedy, but they are financially motivated. That is kind of an important factor in why you become a banker, is that the main thing you want out of it is money. That is not true of teachers or nurses or police officers who go into their professions for very different reasons. I don't think it's to besmirch the city to say that finance is very possibly a motivation they have.
Is that true, Harriet?
Well, I think one thing that's worth highlighting is that, financial services sector, where, as Dave alluded to, 15 years ago I used to work, is a big employer in Scotland, right across the United Kingdom. And in terms of businesses located here, I think I'm right in saying that something like £1 in 10 of tax that's paid in this country comes from the financial services sector. So it's really important because it pays a lot of the salaries of nurses and doctors.
Can I just make the point, though, Iain, that greed comes in a range of different manifestations. It's not all about strutting around in an expensive suit driving a fast car. Some of the greed that we see in the financial services sector in the United Kingdom is about short-termism, and that short-termism that starves investment in R&D and infrastructure and capital.
That's been a long-term problem, hasn't it? Well, that hasn't just occurred in the last few years.
No, never said it did. It's a I malaise,
I agree.
And that feeds directly into low growth.
Just on what you said on police numbers, a texter here is saying you're wrong. Scottish police numbers are at their lowest in nearly a decade. Scottish policing has huge financial strains. Things are not at all well in Scotland.
So, first of all, what I didn't say was that everything is rosy in the garden with policing in Scotland, but the fact of the matter...
I think you said there were more police than ever.
No, I said there are more police in Scotland per 100,000 population than there are in the rest of the United Kingdom, by some margin, actually. So it's not, I would never, ever suggest that things are absolutely perfect. And I think that would be a bit of a naive assertion. But there are 304 police officers in Scotland per 100,000 population and 239 in England.
Because the English are much more law-abiding.
That might be your takeaway.
That was a joke, by the way.
You're going to get cancelled now.
I probably am. It should have happened long before now anyway, Giles. Listen, thank you very much indeed for those answers. We'll come to a very important question that's been in the news over the last 24 hours in just a moment. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
19 minutes past 8. Let me reintroduce my panel. Harriet Baldwin is here, Chair of the Treasury Select Committee. Dave Dugan is SNP Defence Spokesperson and MP for Angus. Giles Kenningham, founder of Trafalgar Strategy, a political consultancy. And Jonn Elledge is a freelance journalist and author. Just before we go on, just do a 30-second elevator pitch for your paperback. Without mentioning the word.
I didn't choose the subtitle, I should say. It's a history of conspiracies and conspiracism dating all the way back to the earliest we found was in the Roman Empire, all the way through things like the blood libel to things like QAnon today, with lots of jokes in it. So it is very much worth your reading. Please do read it.
Right, let's go to our next question. It's Steve in Beckenham. Hello, Steve.
Hello, Iain. Yes, should Diane Abbott's letter be career-ending?
Well, that's a very short and pithy question. For those who don't know, Diane Abbott wrote a letter to the Observer yesterday, essentially asserting that there was a sort of ranking of racism. And it's been interpreted as saying that sort of anti-Semitism isn't quite as serious as racism. I hope that's an accurate summation. She's been suspended from the Labour Party by Keir Starmer, and now there's a big question mark over whether she can stand as a candidate at the next general election. Now, we were to have Shami Chakrabarti, Baroness Chakrabarti, on the panel tonight. Unfortunately, she pulled out today. I'm sure it's got nothing to do with the fact that she did the inquiry into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. But then again, I'm an old cynic. Dave Dugan, let's come to you first on this.
I think it's deeply regrettable that people have had to be upset and old wounds reopened by this very clumsy piece of copy to be submitted. Completely unforced error, sending in a letter. It's not as though she was asked for comment. Sending in a letter to The Guardian and at the same time being deeply offensive to the Jewish community, not just in the United Kingdom, but everywhere that's had the misfortune to catch up with this story. It kind of speaks to a pursuit of a hierarchy in racism and the effects of racism. And I think the excuse it was a draft, that it shouldn't have gone in. Well, I think a lot of us, myself included, will still be concerned with how those thoughts and views find their way into a draft, much less a final draft. So, Diane Abbott is one of those Labour backbenchers which, as a new MP in 2019, certainly opened my eyes to the level of entitlement and inactivity which can pervade within the House of Commons. I sometimes look at the way that I and other MPs of a whole range of parties buzz around the place trying to pull the strings together to try to get a knot into it and to make sure that you're in all the places that you've got to be. And then I see people sort of swaying around like Diane Abbott thinking she should really have more time to put more thought into her letters into The Guardian and try and upset less people with her distorted, let's call it that, historical recollection.
She did apologise very quickly. Should that play a role in whether she's allowed back into the Parliamentary Labour Party and therefore allowed to stand at the next election?
Well, the Parliamentary Labour Party is a dynamic, let's call it that, environment in which candidates jockey for a position.
Unlike the SNP, of course.
Well, we have our own processes and protocols, but
don't we know it?
I have to say, I've been on the wrong side of that before.
Have you? Do tell.
No, Iain. But I know, speaking to Labour colleagues, that the way they can be dealt with by their local parties is really pretty forthright. So I hope that happens with Diane Abbott and she can give an account of herself to her own party, PLP locally, and they can make a decision on whether or not she's a suitable candidate. But if I lived in her constituency, I can't see that I would be voting for her.
Harriet?
Well, it is, an awful letter. And the question that Steve asked was, should it be career-ending? I mean, was it at the last general election or the one before that when she was actually up to be Home Secretary? The Labour Party thought that she would be a good Home Secretary. Was it last?
It was 2019.
Was it 2019? It was just quite recently,
Starmer was
wasn't it?
campaigning on that ticket as well.
And he was campaigning on that ticket. So, I don't think that she would be a good pick risk for the country in terms of being Home Secretary. I think that she has written a terrible letter and been reprimanded for it. She has made it very clear in her apology and set out, as Dave says, rather a lame excuse, I think. But I think...
It's not the first time she's done that either, is it? Because the last time she committed a gaffe with Nick Ferrara and LBC,
really?
She blamed her diabetes for it. And I'm thinking, well, I'm a diabetic and... if my blood sugars go high, I don't make stupid mistakes like that.
Yeah, but as Steve says, career ending. Well, I think as Dave was saying, that's really down to her local party, and we will see.
I mean, I think it will.
Giles.
I think it will be. She's written her own political obituary. Remember, it suits Starmer to kick her out of the party. She's from that hard left of the party, along with Corbyn, who wants to get rid of. And sadly, she's got form for indulging in identity politics. She's done this kind of thing before. It has no place in the modern political landscape. Remember, this was someone who has been on TV praising Mao Zedong. So I rest my case. I think she's done for.
But is that a hanging offence? I mean, she was the first black woman to be elected in 1987. She has a record of fighting racism. Does that not count for anything?
Which is a fantastic achievement, and I'm sure she's had to put up with some very unpleasant things in the past, but she should know better than playing identity politics, and that's clearly what she's done. And this whole idea that it was only a draft, it's like saying the dog ate my homework. I mean, how did it even enter into ink in the first place? So I think she is finished for, and I think it is convenient for Starmer as he sort of looks to say, look, I'm rooting out anti-Semitism in the party. She will go. I cannot see any conceivable way back for her.
Jonn Elledge, Keir Starmer has described it as anti-Semitism, which people didn't say the same about Jeremy Corbyn generally. Some people did, but most people thought that he tolerated anti-Semitism rather than was anti-Semitic himself, whereas Keir Starmer has called this anti-Semitism. Now, you can't row back from that, can you? It's very difficult to imagine a scenario where he could welcome her back after saying that.
It is difficult to see how a party leader can welcome back an MP. They have described in those terms. And the letter was pretty unforgivable, even in the most generous reading. It's very difficult to see a way in which it was not attempting a sort of hierarchy of racism. I think it's a very sad ending because, as you noted a moment ago yourself, she was the first black woman in Parliament. She was a trailblazer. She was an important figure. I would note a couple of other things, though. Firstly, we are an all-white panel discussing this, which is maybe a little bit uncomfortable. And secondly, the slight problem with the Labour Party tried to make a Home Secretary argument is that Suella Braverman is Home Secretary now, and that's not going brilliantly.
Do you think... I've got sort of assailed on Twitter over the last 24 hours because Ash Sarkar was interviewed on LBC yesterday on this issue, and she said some fairly choice things in the past about, I won't say sort of defending anti-Semitism, but sort of praising people who had been described as anti-Semitic. Diane Abbott appears on this programme quite regularly. Do you think, and some of my Jewish correspondents on Twitter were saying, well, you should never have these two people on your programme again. I said, well, thank you very much. I'll choose who's on my programme. I don't need you to tell me. But clearly there is a problem here. If somebody is described in these terms, is she going to be, or should she be, no platformed, not by the Labour Party, but by the media as well, Harriet?
Well, I'm just going to defend Suella Braverman as well, because I think she is implementing what time after time people raise on the doorsteps of my constituency as being one of their top priorities, which is to stop the boats. So
she's not stopping the boats. She's going around pretending that is a thing she has the power to do. That is not the same thing.
She is putting in place this legislation. We're going to have it on Wednesday again, and I imagine the Labour Party will again vote against it.
Because nobody thinks it's going to work.
It's incredibly important
job is
that
not
we
to say
send
to the electorate
a
they can have all
clear
the toys they
message
want.
to people trying to cross the channel that it will not work.
There's an issue back on the Diane Abbott thing, Iain, and it's a function of the parliamentary system in the United Kingdom, particularly in England, where it's generally speaking a two-horse race, and you end up with these colossal majorities where it doesn't actually matter who the party puts up, they'll get elected. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that in her day, Diane Abbott, wasn't a force to be reckoned with. She seems to have lost her way slightly recently, but her majority is 33,000 in her constituency of Hackney North and Stoke Newington. Almost 60% majority.
Just like some SNP majorities.
Absolutely not. There are no safe seats in Scotland.
There are some SNP majorities that are well into 20,000. In fact, I think there are some in the 30,000.
No, there's not. Absolutely not.
You sure?
Yeah, absolutely not. My majority is 3,900. That would be normal in Scotland.
So you'll be out the next election then?
No, because I'm up against the Tories and I'll be working extremely hard to make sure that the good people of Angus have an opportunity to re-elect a hard-working MP for the Angus constituency.
And I'm sure they will. Right, let's move on in just a few moments' time. 0345 6060 973. We haven't covered Sudan yet. We haven't covered Joe Biden launching his re-election bid tomorrow. That's the rumour. The Health Secretary confirming he's taking legal action to stop the nurses' strike. Anything else that you want to phone in on as well, please feel free. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:30. Time for the news headlines on LBC with Josh Bancroft.
A small number of British troops are in Sudan as the government try to identify the best way of getting UK citizens out of the country. Diplomats have already been flown out as violence continues. The Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has told LBC he was staggered when he read a letter written by Diane Abbott about racism. She's apologised for claiming Jewish, Irish and traveller people don't face racism. And the Royal College of Nursing say legal action by the government over planned strike action is wrong and indefensible. The Health Secretary believes the planned walkout on the 2nd of May is unlawful. LBC weather, rain clearing in the southeast to leave a dry and mostly clear night for much of the UK. Wintry showers for the far north of Scotland. A cold night with lows of -4.
This is LBC.
8:34 on LBC. You're listening to Cross Question, or you could be watching us on Global Player. Harriet Baldwin is here, Dave Dugan from the SNP, Giles Kenningham, political consultant, and freelance journalist and author Jonn Elledge. Right, let's go to another question. It's a text question on 84850. Andy in Huddersfield. Is the slowness in getting Brits out of Sudan just the Afghanistan catastrophe all over again? Now, British troops arrived in Sudan today on what's been described as a reconnaissance mission. UK diplomats have been evacuated, but there are still an estimated 4,000 UK passport holders still in the country. Some British nationals have been rescued by French and German armed forces. Harriet Baldwin, you were a Foreign Office Minister.
I was Africa Minister, yes.
Exactly. Yeah. So I want to come to you first on this. There's been a lot of comment about comparisons with Afghanistan. I'm not quite sure they wholly apply here, but of course there are also, I think, more British nationals in Sudan than any other nation by a long stretch.
I think there are 400 mono-passport British nationals in Sudan, as we heard from Andrew Mitchell in today's statement. But
it's 4,000.
4,000 who've got both Sudanese
right.
and British passports. But actually, I think the situation on the ground is considerably worse than Afghanistan for three main reasons. First of all, in Afghanistan, the government, albeit the Taliban government, did actually give permission for flights to leave the airport. Second of all, the airport itself was actually open, which is not the case in Khartoum. And thirdly, it was an environment where we had UK troops on the ground who could help with the evacuation, which is not the case in Sudan. So it's in many ways a much worse situation and very, very difficult. And I think to have been, the second country to manage to evacuate the embassy staff is a remarkable achievement by the troops that were involved. And I think we should pay tribute to that. But it is going to be very difficult and complicated. It is important that those who have not alerted people in the Foreign Office Crisis Centre to their presence in Sudan, they should try and log that presence, because clearly the situation for people is that they are being recommended to remain in their place of shelter, and access to food, to water, is diminishing. And so it's a very, very serious situation, and people are working round the clock to try and rescue those people who are affected who have British passports.
And James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, I think he came back from the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting in Japan a day early, clearly sort of thinking that this was a crisis in the making, and it seems to be getting worse every day, doesn't it? And I mean, how much is there that an individual country's government can do in these circumstances if they have these kind of numbers of people to rescue?
Well, in my opinion, you should try and follow the money in these situations. And of course, there are two rival armies. That's the root of it. And you need to look at who's funding the sort of rebel army. And I know that over the course of the weekend, there were 6 different COBRA meetings held that the Prime Minister himself was in the chair for for 5 of them, including the one at 3 a.m. And a lot of calls have been made to countries in the region, because it is a place where countries in the region are influencing some of these rival armies, and in many cases funding some of their soldiers. So I think following the money and engaging in an enormous amount of diplomacy and engagement with regional countries is what we're doing at the moment. And I think that's the route to trying to achieve the priority, which is a ceasefire, so that the humanitarian access can resume, because this is a country where already, before this happened, there were millions of people on the verge of famine.
And Andrew Mitchell, the International Development Secretary, he made a statement in the House of Commons today. He's been to Sudan many times, has a lot of contacts there. You would hope that counts for something with some people on the ground, I guess.
Well, indeed, he has. I know that when Vicky Ford was Africa Minister, she went out and actually sort of met with both of these generals. She said she's never felt in the presence of evil as much as she did with them. It was really very, very depressing. And then, excuse me. I'm losing my voice, so perhaps we can move on to someone else, and I'll come back to me. Yes, because
so this is a scandalous abdication of responsibility by the United Kingdom government. Many people, many UK nationals, not the least of which will be the 4,000 who are now stuck in Sudan, will be wondering, what is the point in having a colossally expensive diplomatic service with embassies and consulates around the world? What is the point in spending £50 billion a year on our defence forces when push comes to shove? Our political leaders are scared to deploy those resources in the interests of their population.
That's a pretty harsh observation.
Well, what other possible reason can there be for the rest of the top military powers in the European continent have all been in and got out their people? Maybe not all of them, but a substantial.
I think
they're all trying. Yes, they're all trying, and I think, just if I now got my voice back, can add to this that when Dominic Raab was Foreign Secretary, he also went to Khartoum. I in my time went to Khartoum, where this is not somewhere where we have not been trying to engage and trying to achieve a peaceful democratic transition away from the regime of Bashir. But it's not a place where we've had boots on the ground. So I think that's what Dave is highlighting in some of the challenges in terms of getting our citizens out now.
So Harriet wants to follow the money. I want to follow the decision-making process. Who is saying no to this, other than the Prime Minister himself? Because I'm pretty confident that we have defence professionals in the United Kingdom right now who will be working up a cogent plan about how to get some, if not all, of the UK nationals who want to get out of country in a way that minimises risk. But of course, this is inherently risky. It would be much less risky if the Foreign Office had acted sooner to give people very clear instructions to get out of the country. They should have had the intelligence about the situation on the ground to say what was going to happen and what was likely or very likely to happen. And then that could have been done in a much calmer, much more controlled, much less dramatic way than it is having to be done by now. But the UK government absolutely cannot hide behind the fact that other top UK powers are not only taking their own people out of Sudan, they're taking others. And who is taking UK nationals out? Ireland can't take anybody out of Sudan, yet hundreds of Irish nationals have been taken out by their friends. Who's supporting the United Kingdom in this? And why is that?
But I come back to the point that we're talking about up to 4,000 people here. Most of these other countries have maybe got 100, 150 people. We've prioritised the diplomats for understandable reasons, I would have thought. Surely, if the government went in with some sort of military rescue and it all went wrong, you'd be the first to criticise them for taking sort of precipitate action.
So there's two things there, Iain. First of all, just because the government hasn't managed to get any of the UK nationals out except the diplomatic corps doesn't mean that the people who are there don't want to come out. Of course they want to come out, but there hasn't been a single solitary opportunity at the hand of the United Kingdom government for them to actually evacuate the country, unlike other European countries. And if there had, I said earlier on in my previous comment, this is an inherently difficult, kinetic environment in which to try and intervene.
You seem to be rushing to judgment, that's all I'm saying.
But the difference is
a situation where you can't know the details.
I suspect, there's a lot of stuff we don't know.
And that they're working round the clock, as we heard in today's statement.
That they can't tell us for whatever.
To try and reconnoitre and figure out a solution to this problem. So yes, Dave is right to highlight it's an issue, but I think he's wrong to say that people aren't doing everything they possibly can to resolve it.
Only two major Western powers are sitting on their hands: the United States, for reasons best known to them, and the United Kingdom.
John?
This is so far above my pay grade, it's practically in orbit. I
have a go.
It does look incredibly difficult. The response feels... I am in some ways, I never will say this, I'm reassured it's Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister and James Cleverly as Foreign Secretary, because they are both taking those roles more seriously than certain of their predecessors, who I'm sure we could all name. And they do seem to be, as noted, treating this as a genuine crisis in a way that there were certainly moments in which the fall of Afghanistan was not treated with sufficient gravity. But yet clearly there are delays. There are things that are not going... The machine does not seem to be working as one would hope it would. could. And I from where I have no idea if that's a political problem or if that's because this stuff is hard. This is obviously going to be an incredibly difficult job for somebody, but I don't think it's entirely wrong to say one would hope we would be further along.
A text question here on the same subject from Steve. He says, should we not have seen the Sudan situation coming? Is this not an intelligence failure? Well, I suppose you could argue that, but you could also say, well, presumably people on the ground there must have seen it coming, so why didn't they get out themselves when they could?
Well,
was that being unfair?
I don't think we want to blame ordinary people. The intelligence question is really important, not just about the gathering of that intelligence, but the subsequent analysis of that intelligence, and then the subsequent political decision-making of the analysis of that intelligence. And somewhere that has gone a bit awry. But the parallel, which exposes the UK government again, isn't actually Afghanistan, which was a very, very complex situation in which the United Kingdom only had a certain element of control. The parallel is the early days of COVID, when European nations were going around the world chartering aircraft that weren't doing anything else and repatriating their citizens. And when they were doing that, the United Kingdom Foreign Office was saying, just make your own way home, just get home by any means, by any flight, mortgage yourself up to the hilt in your credit card, get yourself home on a commercial route. This is the same culture that pervades in the Foreign Office, and I'm afraid there's an awful lot of British nationals going around the world with a UK passport in their back pocket thinking that if anything goes wrong, they'll be well looked after, and clearly they will not.
Harriet, you're doing very well to remain calm.
I am trying to remain calm because, this is a very, very difficult situation. I'm curious to know who all these other countries are that are managing to get all their citizens out
France, Spain,
without
Italy, Ireland, Turkey,
without
Japan.
any problems at all when the airport is closed, and this is clearly a situation where we've got teams working round the clock to make sure that the people who want to leave are able to, and I would say we don't even know what's going on at this very moment, so I'm very loath to criticise.
Well, one thing that is going on is that Saudi Arabia has just announced that it's evacuating all of its nationals from Sudan, and I suspect that because the airport isn't functioning or we can't get flights in there, no one else can, that will be one way that our citizens that will have to be evacuated, probably through Saudi Arabia.
There's also talk of ships to Port Sudan,
Exactly.
But the other thing that's really important in all this as well, Iain, is that the United Kingdom government has recently made a decision to get rid of its C-130 Hercules aircraft, which don't need runways. They just need a hard standing to land.
Yeah, we've replaced them with the A400 Atlas, which is what was actually used. So
it's a far bigger aircraft, much less flexible.
OK, we'll move on in just a few moments' time. It's 8:46.
LBC.
Arthur has texted in. He says, I'm 12 years old and I'm listening to Cross Question. I enjoy politics. My comment and question for the panel is I honestly believe politics will not look the same by the time I'm an adult. The system and way of electing those in power will no longer be viable. What does the panel think? Or just please share my comment. Well, I have shared your comment. 30 seconds on each of you. By the time he becomes an adult, say in sort of 8 years' time, is politics going to look any different from today, John?
I think we'll very probably have a different government. I think the odds seem to be on that at the moment. I think if Arthur is expecting significant constitutional reform, I think he has a disappointing lesson in the sclerosis of the British state ahead of him.
Giles?
I think politics, the way politicians communicate, is going to dramatically change. I suspect the next election will be the TikTok election, if TikTok hasn't been outlawed in this country, of course. But I do think it's very worrying, the explosion of fake news and what we are doing to tackle this. I don't think the government's on top of that. And for that reason, it does make the future and the way politics is communicated very worrying.
I got invited to appear on a TikTok panel at the Hay Festival in June.
What does that mean, that you can only talk for 20 seconds?
I've no idea, I declined. Harriet?
Well, I mean, Arthur, when you get to 18, do vote. And if you can persuade all the other 18-year-olds in this country to vote, I think there's more likely to be change than currently. The turnout is quite low amongst 18-year-olds.
Dave?
So, Arthur, 6 years will pass quicker than you think, and in 6 years' time there will be significant difference in the United Kingdom because there'll be 59 less MPs because Scotland will be independent. Fewer, I beg your pardon, Ian. Fewer.
You really believe that? Because I would have said Scottish independence was less likely now than it has been for the last 20 years.
And I would urge you to continue with that view.
Arthur, keep listening. Thank you very much. Let's go to Hassan in Westminster. Hassan, what would you like to ask?
Should the UK taxpayers pay for the £100 million Coronation bill, considering the challenging economic conditions and also that the King is worth £1.8 billion, which he's inherited without paying any inheritance tax?
I think we can all get where you're coming from, Hassan. This 100 million figure, I don't know where it's come from, I don't know how it's calculated, but whatever the cost is, should the taxpayer be meeting it? Jonn Elledge?
I mean, I think inevitably the taxpayer was going to meet the cost of the coronation. I think that's how these things work. I do think there was an excellent opportunity here for the royal family to kind of show that times had changed, and that they too can tighten their belts and maybe move us towards a sort of more modest Scandinavian-style monarchy. Whether or not we'll do that in the future, I don't know, but it doesn't feel like the coronation is going in that direction, certainly.
Giles?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a global event. There will be millions and millions of viewers and people watching throughout the world. The royal family is still a massive tourist attraction. It's a big pool. They practically pay for themselves. So, yeah, 100% we should pay for it.
Harriet?
Totally agree. And as an ardent royalist, I would also urge anyone who is thinking of organising a celebration. My understanding is there is money available via your local council to organise celebrations, and people are being encouraged to apply for that. So for people who disagree with you, Hassan, and do want to join in the festivities, then do look into that.
I think Hassan raises a very important point and a valid question. Indeed, there's a question mark over the amount that it's costing, and not the least of which who is paying for that. I think the royal family, I'm not an ardent Republican, I can't think of an argument for the royal family, but I don't go around campaigning to get rid of them. But their future is very short. I can't see it getting past another 2 successions at the very, very most.
Because I think I'm right in saying that Humza Yousaf in the leadership campaign said that he would like Scotland to be a republic within 5 years of independence. Is that something you would subscribe to?
No, I don't subscribe to arbitrary timescales of that nature, with the exception of independence itself. And also, I think, like a lot of things, Scotland will make its own mind up after independence about whether the treaty, the Union of the Crowns of 1603 is still relevant in independent Scotland. I know for a fact that there are many people in Scotland that think it will be, and there is another number that think it shouldn't be, and I would be in that latter category, but I certainly don't stay awake at night worrying about it.
Chris in Stubbington has texted this. There's been a drop in teenagers getting vaccinated against things like tetanus, polio and diphtheria since the COVID pandemic began. Why is this happening, and what can be done to make sure these children aren't at risk of serious illness? Now, only around 7 in 10, 13 and 14-year-olds got that particular vaccine to protect against tetanus, polio and diphtheria last year, a fall of around 7% compared with the previous academic year. Jonn Elledge, is this because of conspiracy theories, do you think?
I'm sure that's a huge factor. Yeah, there is. This does come up in, I should say, our book. This was one of my friend and colleague Tom Phillips' chapters. He wrote about this. But there has obviously been a huge increase in anti-vax sentiment, a lot of which is based on Facebook posts which are complete and utter nonsense. And it would be shocking if that was not one of the things that lies behind this, and it will have real health effects, which is why it's so important to kind of stamp down on this kind of conspiracism wherever.
But how do you do that? How can you sort of stop people believing these ridiculous theories?
If I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be rather richer than I am.
I thought that was the final chapter of your book.
Yes, but it's, you know what the final chapter of a book is. You need to come up with a final. I mean, what I do recall is that you do need to, you need to not treat people like idiots, which is sometimes very difficult when they believe such things that you think are crazy. You do need to kind of talk to them and meet them on their own level, and that is quite a difficult thing to do. I think that's much more of a job for the media than for us as individuals. But I do think we.
Thanks for that. Passing the buck to us.
Isn't some of this just about?
And me too.
And you, yeah.
I think in Germany, if there's fake news on a website, you can face a fine of up to 40 million euros if it's not taken down within 24 hours. We should have more draconian measures like that here.
Well, I totally agree, seeing as someone's impersonating me on Instagram at the moment.
Probably making a lot of money out of you as well.
I mean, first of all, I thought it was quite funny, and then I realised what this guy was saying to people, and it's actually really damaging.
Right.
Harriet.
Oh, it's not just teenagers, is it? It's also children and babies are not getting their immunisations as much as before. I heard, is it Dame Gemini Harry's Public Health England saying that the rate of people taking their polio vaccinations has dropped, and there's evidence of polio re-emerging in London. I just think we've taken for granted the huge advances that vaccinations have delivered for humanity, and we really need to keep telling the positive story about them.
Dave?
It's really pernicious, this business, and particularly when it preys on young parents who feel very vulnerable and insecure oftentimes about doing the right thing for their new children. It's very, very damaging, and I don't know what you can do to fix it. I don't know whether, I don't want to sound like too much of an old crusty, but perhaps influencers can help with this ambition. But I know for my part, you can come on my social media and you can criticise the SNP, you can criticise the Scottish Government, you can talk up the Union, you can talk down independence, but you can't talk nonsense about vaccines. You'll get taken down off my sites.
Quite right too. Right, let's go to our fun question at the end with Janice in Scarborough. If you had to do one dance in front of the classic Strictly judging panel, what style would you choose? And what score do you think you would have got from the late departed Len Goodman, who of course his death was announced today? I don't know how many of you are dancers. Giles.
Why are you looking at me?
I don't know why I'm looking at you either, frankly. But
I mean, I can't dance to save my life. Am I allowed to go for break dancing?
Why not?
I'll give myself a 3, but I think not good under pressure.
Probably being generous.
3 things you break.
Yeah, exactly.
Harriet.
Oh, such sad news about Len Goodman, and I hope he's dancing in heaven. But I can't dance for toffee. He would give me a negative score. Yeah.
What dance would you do?
I'd love to be able to do any kind of dance, and a waltz, a foxtrot, anything, but no, hopeless, I'm afraid.
Dave?
Well, you can't be this elegant, endowed with this height, and not be a proficient tango dancer, Iain. So, especially not with my ganchos. So, I would be doing the tango, and quite naturally, it would be a 10 from Len.
Oh,
Wow. Very bullish.
John?
I actually have slightly less grace than you would think to look at me, and only dance with alcohol and darkness. So I think I would also be a negative score. But if I had to pick one, just for the sake of it, I'm going to say River Dance. Why not?
Do you know, I was at the first ever performance of River Dance in Dublin. Oh. I was actually in tears at the end of it because it just had this amazing effect on the audience. And I don't like any form of dance, but it just had that effect, and it was just amazing. Anyway, Enough of that. Thank you all very much to Dave, to Harriet, to Giles and to Jonn. We have another edition of Cross Question for you tomorrow. And don't forget, at 7, we have Ring Rachel Reeves, your chance to question Labour's Shadow Chancellor as well. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to return to the subject of Diane Abbott. Her comments on racism were anti-Semitic, say Keir Starmer. Does this prove that the Labour Party hasn't really changed enough and has a long way to go? Do you think it should be career-ending for Diane Abbott? Or given that she apologised, is there a way back for her? Should she be allowed to stand as a candidate at the next election, given that she issued a quick apology, which, of course, Jeremy Corbyn has singularly failed to do? The number to call, 0345 6060 973, here on LBC.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. The Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, has told LBC the situation in Sudan is delicate. His work continues to try and get UK citizens out of the country. A small number of British troops are there to help put together an evacuation plan as violence continues. Diplomats were flown out on Saturday. But SNP defence spokesperson Dave Dugan has told Iain Dale that opportunities have already been missed.
It would be much less risky if the Foreign Office had acted sooner to give people